and welcome to this evening's panel. I'm standing right in front of that projector and I can't see anything. Combat and Art, an Interdisciplinary Conversation, sponsored by the Art Museum of West Virginia University. My name is Heather Harris and I am the Art Museum's Curator of Education, and I will also be moderating tonight's panel. The impetus for this evening came out of an exciting new endeavor that the Art Museum embarked upon last spring. In an effort to engage faculty across the university with the museum's collection in substantive ways, we created a faculty fellowship. This fellowship is an opportunity for a selected faculty member to enhance their teaching and scholarship by collaborating with Art Museum staff to develop an exhibition related to the fellow's area of expertise using the Art Museum's collection of more than 4,000 objects. We are so pleased that Dr. Lisa Bartolomeo, a teaching professor from the Department of World Languages, Literature, and Linguistics, and coordinator of both the Russian Studies and Slavic and East European Studies programs, was our first fellow. She proposed an exhibition related to the themes explored in her course, The Holocaust in East European Film and Literature. Upon receipt of her application, the museum staff was enthusiastic, but also worried, because our collection does not have a particular strength in East European art. However, what was strong was Dr. Bartolomeo's application and her enthusiasm for collaborating with the museum. So we awarded her the fellowship, and she and our curator, Robert Bridges, set about the task of expanding the ideas and themes that were central to her course on the Holocaust and finding how they resonated with other works in our collection. The resulting exhibition, In Humanity, Combat and War in Art, is on view in the Art Museum through May 14th and open to the public from 12:30 to 6, Thursday through Sunday. And when you do visit, as I hope many of you already have, you will witness the powerful artworks that engage universal themes of trauma, justice, survival, and witnessing. It is these themes that bring us here tonight with our esteemed panelists, who include Dr. Bartolomeo, as well as two other guests with scholarly and professional connections to tonight's topic. Kristina Olson is the director of the School of Art and Design and a professor of art history. She has taught courses on modern and contemporary art and has expertise in the art and artists whose work grapples with the particularities of 20th and 21st century life, including the devastation of 2 world wars and countless other conflicts whose toll manifest themselves across the artistic movements that define the last century of art history. Cody Corliss, Associate Professor of Law, is a former war crimes prosecutor at 2 international criminal tribunals, playing a key role in the search for justice amidst trauma. This depth and breadth of experience truly highlights the value of interdisciplinary dialogue and the role that art can play in provoking important conversations about global issues. So, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa, who is going to speak a little bit more about the development of the In Humanity exhibition.
I'm going to try not to walk in front of the spotlight either. First, I do want to thank and acknowledge Bob Bridges, without whom I would not be here today, because Bob, when I walked in, had already picked out some things that he thought would fit with my theme. And it was such a pleasure to work with you over the past year, Bob, finding things that worked, finding things that didn't work, and then at the last minute finding something that even you had forgotten about that was just absolutely perfect and is actually the centerpiece of what I'm going to talk about tonight. So thank you, Bob. Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Heather. Thank you to Madeline. Everybody was so incredibly helpful, and I would encourage any faculty in the audience tonight absolutely to apply to the fellowship. It's been a transformational experience. It has enhanced my teaching. It has enhanced the way I think about what I do and what I've brought to my class this semester. And I have a couple of students, 3 students actually, from that class tonight. So I'm excited about that. First, I want to walk you through the exhibition and tell you a little bit about what Bob and I were thinking as we developed it, how we decided to position the works of art, and what our theme was essentially drawing us through. So as Heather mentioned, the idea is the idea behind the class, the Holocaust in East European Literature and Film. And that class focuses on lesser known works. It is not a history class. It's a class of understanding the Holocaust through works of art. So it fit really nicely with what we wanted to do with this exhibition. And what we wanted to do was take people through and help them understand the way combat and violence and trauma can be expressed either through beautiful works of art, through traumatizing works of art, through dramatic works of art, through a great variety of things as we see them. And so Bob and I, when we started thinking about this, how many of you have been through the exhibit already? Ooh, so lots of you have a fun treat in store for you, because I assume you're all going to come back and do it tomorrow or Saturday or Sunday or multiple times. So we started with this very traditional, academic, realistic looking piece because we wanted, thinking in terms of who was going to be coming here, students, and we wanted to make it as approachable as possible for students. We wanted to show them something easily understandable, easy to read, that would sort of welcome them in, make them comfortable with going through the rest of the exhibition. Obviously, then we're going to hit them with some slightly more challenging pieces. So when you go through the exhibition, you'll turn right, which is something I learned from Bob and Madeline, that that's the way you go. And you'll turn right and you'll see our labels and our big pieces. This I was really excited about. I love this Czech artist, Jiří Anderle. He's one of our few Slavs. So Bob very kindly found a Czech for me. And so we have 4 pieces that I think we're going to talk a little bit about later in the talk, and then a 5th piece as well. The 4 on the wall there are World War I, and then we have the 5th piece on the wall has Hitler graphically depicted. And so we wanted to kind of take you through and begin to get you thinking about how art can depict trauma not only to the spirit but also to the body, and violence as it can be taken out on the human being. And so we're moving through that way. We're moving across time periods. We didn't limit ourselves in time period. We didn't limit ourselves just to Europe. We tried to move around as much as we could, keeping in mind what the collection has on hand. So we move across, and we've got a World War I piece, and then let's move over here. We've got What to Do with the Nazis, very obvious piece talking about a plan for what to do with the Nazis after the war, and then the piece that we're going to talk about in a second. Then we move all the way through next to, oh, I do have a pointer. Okay, right here, a really interesting photograph that has been treated, but comes from Vietnam. And to me, it was really important to include something rather than just looking like we're looking at European fascism or European violence and oppression, making clear that the United States has had its hand in such activities as well, right? And then we move across. I don't want to, oh, I went backwards. There we go. And Kristina is going to talk about these. But at the very end, I want to make sure that we talk about the Leon Golub, because this was really important to Bob and me to end with this one. If you think about it, it's on the other side of the academic realist piece, and we have a message at the end, but I'll return to that in a second. This is the piece that I most wanted to talk about tonight. And those of you who've been through the exhibition already have seen this. And this is a piece that Jack Levine did as a sort of in dialogue with propaganda films and photographs that the Nazis did, as well as Jews and others in documenting the ghetto, right? So this is from the Warsaw Ghetto, or it's based on a photograph from the Warsaw Ghetto. And there were 2 kind of opposing philosophies in documenting what happened inside the Warsaw Ghetto. So the Warsaw Ghetto was active from the fall of 1940 until the spring of 1943, after the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. And 360,000 people were murdered, either within the ghetto or on their way to Treblinka. Over the course of its existence, over 400,000 people had been kept within the walls of the ghetto, separated from the quote-unquote Aryan side of Warsaw. Now, one of the things that you'll see is that the Nazis themselves propagandized the ghettos. They took advantage of the corralling of these human beings and took photographs, made films of them in order to depict them either as happy, right, so that they could use it for propaganda and say, oh, what we're doing in these ghettos is not as bad as you think it is, right? There's even a film that later became known as the Hitler gives the Jews a city about Theresienstadt ghetto outside of Prague. And so he used it to show, for instance, to the Red Cross, to say, oh, see, people are fine, we have shops, we have hospitals, banks are open, everyone's getting along just fine. That's one route of the Nazi propaganda. The more obvious and probably more familiar to most of us route of Nazi propaganda is the idea that we're showing Jews as less than human, as diseased, as depraved, as starving, as vermin or lice or lesser beings, right? And so it was very important to them to document the starving children lying on the sidewalks of the Warsaw Ghetto, or the corpses along the streets in the Łódź Ghetto. And those two opposing motives behind Nazi photography and filmmaking in the ghettos is balanced out also by Jewish and non-Jewish photographers and documentarians. So for instance, Grossman, who photographed a lot in the Łódź Ghetto, his impetus was the opposite of the Nazi impetus, and it was about documenting and testifying and giving witness to people who were being erased. And I think that's what I like about this piece, is that Levine has kind of erased the Nazis as well as the Jews. The figures are very abstracted, they're degraded, they've kind of been rubbed out a little bit in a sense. And I think this one really spoke to me, and I was so pleased that Bob found it at the last minute and we were able to include it. And I think that this one is maybe a good segue into what Cody is going to talk about. And one of the reasons we wanted Cody to be part of this is because this is his area of expertise, right? Testimony, bearing witness. So with that, I will hand it over to Cody.
Thanks, Lisa. So thank you, Lisa, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. As Heather mentioned, Heather probably didn't mention that I'm fairly new, actually, to West Virginia University. I just arrived and joined the Faculty of Law I just joined the Faculty of Law in August. And before that, I'd spent the last, I'm going to move back because I hear some echo. I spent the last 7 years working as a war crimes prosecutor with the United Nations. And specifically working on cases involving genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. And so in a sense, seeing this exhibition brings back a lot of feelings and thoughts I've had about when I was practicing in The Hague in the Netherlands, about how do we think about justice, and what does justice mean? As a prosecutor, there's this idea of retributive justice, where we are punishing wrongdoing specifically. But also, within the UN as a prosecutor, we have this mandate also to, one of our mandates as prosecutors is to quote unquote bring peace to the region. And part of that approaches justice from a different angle, and that's restorative justice, where we're trying to make societies whole again. And given those two different dynamics, I've tried to actually incorporate that within my classroom, within criminal law, to encourage my students to think about what justice means as a prosecutor, to punish wrongdoing, but also the goal of rehabilitating and restoring society and restoring equilibrium. To me, this same image really stood out to me in a different way, because it really captures, in my mind, a moment of horror. And it reminds me very much, I'm the the one with the least art background, but it reminds me so much of a newspaper and kind of something as a piece of a historical record. But at the same time, as Lisa mentioned, this artist has manipulated the image and obscured the faces. And in my mind, it really gives this everyman quality, or where we don't know who these individuals are. And there's a universality to this horror. And the artist really invites us to envision it in that way. And so I ask myself, and I wonder, what does justice look like for the people captured in this image? And the horror, for me as an onlooker, is we know the ultimate result of what happened. But it's left to then for the viewer to think about, what does justice look like from a retributive angle, from a restorative angle. And I think about that as a prosecutor. One of the hardest things I had as a prosecutor is you always come too late, in a sense. That you arrive after the bombs have found their targets, or the snipers have fired, after the mass graves have been full. And this is a moment when we look at this image where we haven't yet arrived too late as a society. These people are still captured in a moment of breathing and walking. But we know we're gonna act too late under these circumstances. And to me, in some sense, it's sort of a clarion call and a wake-up call. One of the famous things we say following the Holocaust is never again, but it reminds me of just never again, and that we need to be cognizant of the horrors that are going on in our world. So to me, that's what this image speaks to. And one thing I think that's so impressive about this exhibition is it just shows the wealth of material. Again, I'm new to West Virginia University. I'm from West Virginia originally, but I was away for 25 years. And this exhibit really speaks to the wealth of material in this museum that Lisa and Bob have put together such a spectacular show covering so many different images. So I think it really speaks to them and to the excellence of the quality of the collection here. I also wanted to talk a little bit about another piece that spoke to me, and there are four pieces, and this is, as Lisa also referred to these pieces. Underlay is the artist, and he's Czech, correct? He's a Czech artist, and it's hard to see this here, and I'll go into a close-up, but there's a juxtaposition of a photograph and then an artist's rendering in dry point. So we have that photograph, and then this is maybe a close-up of one of the images. And to me, this really speaks in many ways, first of all, clearly to the horrors of war. And we get a sense of what soldier's son and wife. And we see trauma as it happens to the soldier in this image. But we also see, to me, there's also an image of survival, and we have the wife and the son who survive, and we have a family that is cleaved. And what's interesting in the image is, the artist has chosen the woman is bare, both metaphorically and literally. She is without clothes, and she's stripped bare. And as a prosecutor, it reminds me, I reflect on this idea of survivors and the bravery of those who've survived, and the bravery of testimony that survivors and victims are forced to come into court and to relive their most traumatic days and moments of their lives, and to tell it in open court. And to me, that is incredibly brave, but also incredibly traumatic. So when I think of this image, I think I see the horror of war, but also those who have survived the horrors of war and are then stripped bare and are left to bear witness to what happened. So with that, I'll pass it to Kristina.
Thank you. Gosh, so of course, as the person coming from the field of art history, what I feel like I can maybe just add briefly to the discussion so far that's focused a lot on the content is just to point out a few things that I'm noticing. You're probably noticing other things as well in terms of the artist's decisions, the artistic decisions made, and also maybe to mention something a bit about the content in concert with the medium of these particular works, what they're made out of, and then take that discussion to a comparison I want to make next. So Anderle here has made a print. Both of these first two works are prints, the Levine work and this one. So another interesting aspect connecting to the content here is these are works of art that exist as multiples. So here Anderle starts with a photograph that exists as a multiple, one assumes. There's not just one, like a painting. And same with the Levine, right? It was based on a photograph that one assumes exists or could exist as a multiple. And now the artist is interpreting that photograph and making a print that exists as a multiple. In other words, it can be in the hands of many and not just the hands of one person. So it takes the preciousness away from that image and has a democratic reach that was clearly important to these artists, because why choose to make it as a print if that's not important to you, right? And where Anderle in his prints is working on a metal plate, right? We've got dry point here. I'm not a printmaker. We've got printmakers in the room who can correct me afterward or now. But basically, you're working with a sharp needle-like tool to draw these figures in a metal plate, right? So Anderle, when you look at the prints in the exhibit and get up close, these are pretty sizable prints. There's lots of detail in those faces. So they're very specific. He's really copying the detail from the photographs. Levine, by contrast, was taking advantage of the lithographic medium here. Lithography is done not on a metal plate, but on a limestone, very smooth, polished limestone. And it's a much more painterly, you can have a much more painterly touch. And so when Cody and Lisa talked about that kind of velvety black in the shadows here, that's a quality Levine is able to get because he chose lithography, where dry point would have a different quality. And also, you both mentioned how Levine takes the specificity of the figure's identity that surely was captured in the photograph and blurs it, again, with that brushy quality of working on the stone. And as Cody said, it takes us from the specific individual to a more universal figure, right? You can project yourself or your loved ones into those images. Anderle, interestingly, uses that specificity that he can get with dry point. We see the individuals in terms of the details in their faces, but then he abstracts the bodies, right? They're missing, they're barely there. And the trauma to the soldier figure becomes all the more pronounced, something Anderle really takes advantage of. The exhibit shows us many works that have trauma to the human body. I'm going to mention a couple more just in a second. But I wanted to point out that many of the Anderles in the exhibit, many of the works, the Levine as well, were donated by the collectors, Dr. Laura and Paul Maceros, both of whom were medical doctors whose job was to heal the traumatized body. And I find it interesting that their collection is so full of that kind of work. Whoops, which way am I going? Sorry, you would think I'd have this down. I'll just say a couple words about this comparison and then toss things back to the other panelists. Lisa mentioned the decision she and Bob made to start the exhibition with the very realistic painting by the British 19th century painter William Eddy. And the human figures here are fully realized in what we'd call a kind of academic realist style, right? Very, in fact, Eddy was sort of scandalously one of the first painters in England really focusing on depicting the nude body in his paintings. By contrast, you might wonder how I could bring in this abstract work. So the Stanley William Hayter on the right is a modern 20th century artist working in an abstract vocabulary, very different style. The medium here between these two is also quite different. We've got the Eddy oil painting on canvas, and it's a pretty good sized painting. The Hayter print is a print. It's engraving and etching, and it's on paper, and it's pretty small. This is the work that opens the exhibition. This print is second from the end, if we follow your path through the show. And they've got the same title, Combat. But I just wanted to point out that even though, whoops, oh, I'm sorry, guys. I should just set this thing down. Even though we've got very different approaches to the human figure, and Hayter felt he had figures in here that he was making almost completely abstract. Even though our style between our two artists is so different, they essentially both show the idea of combat, not just through the subject matter, like on the left, it's a battle scene, but through the way each artist handles the formal decisions. And let me just point out a couple, and then I'll move on. Both compositions work with a strong diagonal running from the upper right corner to the lower left. Diagonals are an activating compositional device, so right away that brings energy and movement into the composition. Both artists, again, even though as different as they are, different media, put us up very close to the mass of compositional forms. We would say in art history that Eddy has his figures close to the picture plane, as if they're just on the other side of a window. But so does Hayter. This mass of abstract forms is large in scale on that sheet of paper. Finally, the use of complementary colors is very similar. So Eddy's working with the contrast of pinks and reds against blues and greens, same in the Hayter composition. So even though the style is so different, we have similar decisions. I was just going to mention briefly that Hayter made that print in New York in 1953 after he left England because of the war in, I think, 1939, just before the war. He was good friends with Picasso. He first made versions of that combat print. It's actually a much larger version that he made in England in his studio there, working on that in 1936 after he had been allowed to visit Spain during the Spanish Civil War and was really struck by the violence he saw there. So this theme of combat in Hayter's print originates from his experience, literally, of viewing combat in Spain. And Picasso was hanging out in Hayter's studio in Paris in '36 as he was commissioned to make this major mural, this painting, Guernica, one of Picasso's absolute masterpieces. It's a mural scale painting over 25 feet long oil on canvas. And it deals with commemorating the bombing and killing of civilians and animals in this little Basque village, Guernica, during the Spanish Civil War. It was the Nazi fighter bombers who bombed the town after being invited in by the Spanish nationalists. Terrible tragedy. And note that Guernica, even though it's a large painting, Picasso makes the same compositional decision as Levine to use black and white. This isn't a black and white photo, this is the true colors of the painting. So again, we have the modern artists using, kind of appropriating the look of a documentary photography, so that we never forget this horrible example of human violence. And like Hayter, Picasso, of course, is using abstraction to take us from the specific to a more universal theme, as Cody said.
So I think moving on, Lisa and Cody and Kristina all wanted to have kind of a piece of closure that has to do with that closing piece in the exhibition that Lisa spoke about in her opening moments. And so if you want to click onto that. Yeah.
I'll go last.
Oh.
Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. We were talking about other pieces that spoke to us, and I'd learned about the Walking Man actually from a book. And Annie Dillard, the author, spoke about her experience with Walking Man and what it represented. And after reading about it, I was so intrigued, and actually one of the copies is at the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. So I took, at the time I was at home in Wetzel County, and drove up to see it. And it always, to me, Giacometti's Walking Man represents this, both the horrors of the 20th century, but also the human spirit to survive. And we see this, what I assume it's this bronze statue, this spindly man, really reduced to his husk, but at the same time, there continues to be forward motion. Mm-hmm. So to me, it's a testament both to the tragedies of the first part of the 20th century, but also to our collective spirit to keep walking.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love this comparison that Cody brought in as we were discussing what we might talk about. So, of course, the Giacometti sculpture is not in the exhibition. I wish we could get the Giacometti.
No shame to Todd.
Yeah, and promise me if you go see the wonderful one in the Carnegie collection, it's more than life size. You've got to stand behind it so that you feel like you're in the position of this figure. But Cody's comparison makes such a good segue to that, what is the final work in the exhibition. So the print on the right, notice the medium, another lithograph. So this is Leon Golub, one of the greats of American contemporary art. And his figure draws together some of these compositional decisions I've already mentioned to make a similar statement to what Giacometti's making in cast bronze. Your point, Cody, of yes, 20th century man, battered and beaten down to the absolute nub, but not quite gone. As you say, still standing, still moving forward. And whoops, here I go again. Golub, too, giving us an abstracted figure, so like some of the artists we've mentioned that are not working realistically, he too abstracts the human figure. Notice the use of the dramatic diagonal compositional placement of the figure, right? So moving now from the lower right to, lower right to the upper left. And then that arc of that gesture, a call to arms, a call to move forward, a call not to give up. Some of you may know that Golub and his wife, the artist Nancy Sparrow, were major figures in the American protests against the Vietnam War, and moved to Canada so their sons would not get drafted. So they spent their whole lives with their art, fighting against violence, fighting against war, and I think that's such a great uplifting image you chose to end with.
So, like Kristina said, we envisioned this as a call to arms, as a way to end the exhibition, not just go home and be comfortable, go back to your normal lives, but follow me on to activism, think about the causes that I have roused you to. And when I first saw this was one of the very first pieces that Bob brought out from the collection. And when I first saw this, I was struck by its resemblance to an icon tradition. So one of the classes I teach is on Russian fairy tales, and I do an entire class period on how to read an icon. And so one of the things in that is you will notice the Odigitria, or the Mother of God who is pointing the way, right? And Odigitria literally means pointing the way. And she's showing us the way forward, normally into salvation through her son. But what struck me about this piece was this is Golub saying, come with me, this is the way. You need to move on, you need to rouse yourself out of your apathy, out of sitting and watching Netflix. You need to think about your place in the world. You need to think about bearing witness for people who've been erased, who've been silenced, and whether that's people in the Holocaust, whether that's people in Vietnam, whether that's people in Turkey or Syria, or whether that's people in Ukraine. It seemed like a good way and a valuable way and a stirring way to send people home from what might otherwise be kind of a traumatic exhibition for the viewer. So with that, I think we're ready to take questions, but thank you all for your attention.
Yeah, so I actually do want to break away a little bit from the kind of speaker. We build this as a discussion, and I truly want it to be a discussion both amongst our panelists. So, you know, in the first half of our time here, they've really shared their impressions and pieces that resonated with them. But I would love to have both your all's input, but have this become kind of more loose and conversational. With that said, we are creating a YouTube recording for our YouTube playlist. We're not streaming live right now, but to have a conversation, you have to be amplified, which means I will be traveling through the audience. So it can be so informal, but I'll be traveling through the audience with a microphone. If you have something that you want to ask or a provocation to lead to more discussion, then we're really excited for you to do that. Does anyone have anything right off the bat, or should I provoke first? All right, I'll do it first. I'll let people gather their thoughts. So one of the things that came to me kind of in my role as educator, and then also thinking about how we've wrapped up this panel, is thinking about what is the value of this kind of call to action and also this discussion and dialogue on a university campus. And what would you hope is the call to action? You mentioned kind of thinking about students coming into this space. And what would be your hopes for students coming into this space, Lisa? Or how do you think some of these understandings and impressions that you've spoken about can impact us as a university community, as a learning community, and especially thinking about students?
I would say a couple of things. First, I think that one of the things that we wanted to accomplish was publicizing the fact that WVU has an art museum and that it's a wonderful resource, and that we would like more people to traipse across to Evansdale and get off the PRT and come and visit it. So that was part of the motivation, and as part of that, Bob and I were really careful to try to pick pieces that would both challenge and be recognizable to people who maybe don't feel comfortable looking at or thinking about or talking about art. So we tried as much as possible to to be as open and welcoming in that sense, even as we challenge them with some pretty horrific images from pretty horrific eras and time periods and places. So I would say that's a starting point.
Anything else?
Well, I would also, add that the exhibit makes the point that I think is vital for people to understand that, art is always arguing a position, right? One could say art is always activist in that way, whether it's arguing to remember someone in a portrait, whether it's arguing to tell a story that you feel shouldn't be forgotten, whether it's translating a point of religious material, whether it's openly political, right? And so artists like Golub, who are now, we're seen as truly being activist artists, self-identifying that way, have really become kind of the norm in today's contemporary art practice. And I know our students, our art students, are wanting to make an art that's relevant socially in parts of their lives beyond just something that would be on the walls of a museum or simply be thought of as, beautiful to look at. I'm sure that desire to, make something that's visually interesting is still top of mind, but they want their art to do more than just give you a pretty picture. And I think this exhibition makes that point, and you've made the point why we need artifacts like these artworks to keep us remembering even the bad things that happen in life.
All right, I have it. I knew I could count on Professor Light to contribute to the conversation. Are we on, Jason? Is this mic on? Okay.
So, Dr. Bartolomeo, I wondered if you could address a stylistic choice, I guess, you made in the arrangement of the exhibition. So, if Jason, if you would go back a couple slides for me, or somebody, whoever's controlling here. There. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the pieces that that I'm thinking of are basically the Warsaw Ghetto piece with then the actual kind of horrific kind of what to do with the Nazis piece. So, because I think that's going to be one of the strongest comparisons for students walking in, because they're the most kind of, at least at first, visceral reaction I had to kind of seeing this image. So will you just talk about that choice and kind of the decision to put those two closest together to each other?
Sure. Actually, probably Bob is a better person to talk about why we put that one in at the last. It was in part because that was the last one that we found, and I don't know, Bob, if you want to speak to that a little bit. Do you?
Well, not really. I think you're doing a great job doing it.
Not really.
When we're working in the gallery, and this was particularly nice working with Lisa because she's not.
I don't know anything about art.
Experience, right, of doing this. So it's the telling of the story that we're interested in, right? So we want this exhibition to be read in a way, mm-hmm. and the way we're doing it is setting it up so you move from piece to piece, but also those juxtapositions and comparisons are important. And that was basically, as you remember, replaced a smaller piece mm-hmm. that we had in
mm-hmm.
that spot. And it was specifically for that reason, right?
Right,
that we
right.
wanted to continue that part of the story.
Right, and I think it's also, we didn't want to just be about Nazis, right? We wanted to broaden it, we wanted to open it up. And as I said earlier, that was why we wanted the Vietnam picture in there. We have the World War I picture in there. Sorry. So we ranged in terms of time periods, in terms of places, and it would have been really simple to say, oh, it's tied to a class on the Holocaust, so we're going to concentrate on World War II. We're going to show a lot of evil Nazis, we're going to show a lot of victimized people, but we wanted to make sure that it wasn't that simple, right? So when you walk into the gallery, you don't just get to relax and say, oh yes, Nazis are bad, right? Which until recently was not a controversial point to make. But now you can move through and you can see, oh, over the course of history, over the span of time, people have always fought one another. People have always done violence to one another. People have always done violence to bodies and minds and spirits. And art, as Kristina said, has always been there to capture that, not only to, as Cody said earlier, to communicate for the people who no longer have voices, but also to mark it as part of the human experience, right? It would be really easy to say, you know, oh, art should be sublime, it should be beautiful, and we should look at nice, pretty things, right? You go into a Marriott lobby and you see the same cookie cutter pictures. But what we wanted to do was to challenge that idea a little bit and to get people to think about art as not just pretty pictures. Yeah.
I wonder, as I'm thinking again, I keep going back to my wheelhouse as an educator, and thinking about these themes of trauma and witnessing, and I think speaking to what Megan was saying a little bit about the visceral impact of some of this. And I've thought a lot recently, especially after the trauma of the pandemic, and how we take care of each other and each other's mental health. And so how do we think through both making sure that this witness is shown and that students experience it and get that very loud and clear kind of never again message, but how do we also grapple with perhaps sharing potentially traumatic or triggering works of art in an academic context, and what is our responsibility there for both for being witnesses ourselves, but also for taking care of those who experience these works of art.
Was that a question?
Yeah, what is our responsibility toward,
Okay.
I mean, I think those are things, but thinking about how you all think about that when you look at an exhibition that has folks hanging and people who we know now did not survive long beyond when this photograph was taken and things like that.
I'll start off and then I'll hand it off to Cody or Kristina. We did have people on the day we opened who reported feeling very triggered by some of what they saw. And you know, when people take my class on the very first day, I make sure that they understand this is not going to be an easy class. Excuse me. From the perspective of, I'm not saying, oh, we're going to have a lot of papers to write or anything like that, but the material itself, the stories you're going to read, the films you're going to watch, the poems you're going to work on, it's hard. It's hard to confront. It's hard to take home with you. And, you know, at the same time, I do, as much as possible, I want students to be supported. I want them to be thinking about their mental health and protecting themselves. I encourage them to journal about it. But I also kind of lean on the side of, we have to challenge ourselves this way. We have to see. It's too easy to just back away or to avert your eyes or ignore what happens, right? And obviously, if it's too much for an individual, yes, they should step out. They should not be in the gallery, take a break, something like that. But I also think it's deeply, deeply important and kind of a human imperative for everyone to look, to speak, to write about it, to talk about it. Okay. Do you want to, prosecutor, say anything?
I think I don't have much to add, and I think you've ably captured, this is the world we live in. And it's important to acknowledge the world we live in versus the world we want. And so to me, challenging ourselves to understand the world we live in also is a call to do more and to be better to create the world we want. So I think you've hit that right on the head.
I didn't mean to steal your thunder.
Nope, excellent.
Yeah, and I would say, really, we have an obligation in an educational setting like West Virginia University to present the full spectrum of material in all the disciplines taught at the university. So Yes, absolutely, one has to be mindful that you don't blindside students or the general public in terms of what's they're about to see, and allow for the possibility that they're not going to be able to come in and see that work. But yeah, we must put these works before ourselves and come back to them and again to ponder what they're capturing and what the artist was driven to make the artwork for, which is to keep us remembering. I've got colleagues in art history here and studio art who we deal with this every day, right? What do you do when you know you need to show work that can be difficult or challenging? But it's true probably in any discipline, right? I know the musicians here that probably have to, there are compositions that can take your listener into a dark place, and you know, that's part of, as you said, Heather, the range of human experience that we're obligated to deal with in an educational setting.
Anybody else? Mr. Tabutis.
First, thanks everybody for your perspectives. A word that's come up a couple times is the word evidence in relationship to either the source material for some of these works or just what we see in general from these conflicts. And I guess question partly for Cody, or mostly for Cody, is as somebody who has been a prosecutor, you may have seen more evidence than any of us in this room in some of these conflicts. Can you speak a little bit more about when that becomes art? Like, from your perspective of that, you know, what we see as a fact on the ground versus something we're putting on the wall to have a different kind of moment with.
You know, I think that's really interesting, and I wish I should have thought of this. There's much of the work I did as a prosecutor concerned urban warfare in Sarajevo, and specifically the shelling and sniping of civilians in Sarajevo. When shells are fired into the urban core, they leave a crater. Those craters have remained, and they've been covered now with a red resin. And they were initially they were covered that way because, for investigative purposes, because one can determine based on the markings of the crater, where the shell, how far the shell traveled, what angle. So it was actually used for analysis initially. But those have been repurposed they've been repurposed within the city as an idea of remembrance. And people call them Sarajevo roses. Roses. Oh, my voice, yeah. Sorry, you know, yeah, I'm sorry about that. I hear the echo, so that's part of the concern. Yeah, we call them Sarajevo roses, or I don't, I mean, the people who live there do. And they're used in a sense, what was once, they're places for memory and to remember the horrors of what happened in Sarajevo in the early 90s. So to me, when you mention that, that's the one, my mind immediately goes there.
Was everybody able to hear the first part of the description?
I'm sorry
of
if
the
I was...
Roses? Okay, all right. Yeah, that's fine. It's a really cavernous space. It's challenging. Anybody else? Well, I just want to say thank you. I sort of... it was kind of a trick question in the sense that this is exactly why we brought this panel together, because we know that this is the important work of having these conversations at a university, and that talking about these difficult issues and thinking about careful, thoughtful ways to confront them from all sorts of disciplines is the way that our students will go forward and be like the Golub and become activists to make the world that they want rather than the world that there is. So I'm very hopeful. Oh, wait, Lisa has a plug.
I have two plugs. Heather talking about the let's go forth and do good. Tomorrow at 5 o'clock, there will be a rally for Ukraine in front of the mountain lair. Everybody's welcome. And then on Sunday at 7 at 123 Pleasant Street, we will be hosting a Ukraine benefit concert. Some really great bands, some even better raffle treats and prizes that you can sign up for. So all of the money that we raise from that concert will go to help people on the front lines. So far, the Morgantown community has raised over $26,000, which is something to be proud of. So when Golub is leading us forward, I think he's talking to us. So thank you.
Yeah. It was at the, oh, those are
That's
for the
my
two
plug.
events.
That's
Okay.
my plugs.
And I guess I will also close with a plug to any faculty here or to anyone students who are working with faculty or faculty colleagues. The application is now open for the next year's faculty fellowship. We will be doing this again. We will provide summer research funding for the selected faculty member to work on a project similar to this, but obviously engaging the own themes and topics that are pertinent to you and your work. And those applications are due by March 20th. I have more information about that. It was in e-news a couple of days ago. But I am really, really excited by the opportunity that this exhibition and this project has had to bring folks together from across the university. We have 3 different colleges represented, which I think is very exciting. There's 3 different colleges represented here tonight and brilliant minds that are doing incredible work. So thank you all for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom with us. Thank you. Oh, Todd. Oh, yes, sorry. There's more plugs. Stay for more plugs. So as part of the fellowship, we ask that the fellow engage in public programming. This is obviously part of that, and Lisa will also be doing our Lunchtime Looks series in April, on April 14th. It's usually the first Friday of the month, but that day is our spring holiday, so it's bumped to the second Friday of the month. April 14th, Lisa will be doing our Lunchtime Looks, where you can really be in and amongst these works of art for things like scale, understanding what Kristina was saying about the Hayter and the Eddy and their different space. There's nothing better than being there, we say, in the museum field. So please do come join us in the gallery for that at noon on April 14th. And please make sure you find your way to the exhibition sometime before it closes in May. And thank you all. Thank you for being here. Have a wonderful evening.